Happy Tuesday, everybody. Every Tuesday, I like to go over the community deck techs, and I just wanted to say thank you for being part of the community. I really wanted to start this kind of back and forth conversation about Magic cards, kind of like you get at a local game shop, and I think we've kind of achieved that. So I've been really happy that most of the conversations have been pretty civil, and we're just all able to enjoy Magic the Gathering. So thank you for that. And we're going to start things off here with the first submission. So, actually, one more thing. I'm not going to be doing the community deck techs for the next week, just because we're going to be kind of... I know there's a lot of excitement about the Bloomburrow space, but what I want to do is kind of get a week of actually playing and familiarizing myself with the new meta in rotation before I can actually give any useful feedback in that area. Right, so I'll do my best for what's being kind of put forward here, because none of these cards are Bloomburrow, so I feel relatively confident about my knowledge base. But it'll be available again. I plan to bring it back on the community tab in 2 weeks, so we're going to take a week off. And so yeah, nothing this week. Look for it next week. That wasn't confusing at all. Anyway, so this one was by J Money 9494, and this was an Abzan Discard list. And looking through it, my first impression was, is green worth it? Is green actually worth the 3-color space? So we're basically doing like the Orsov discard control with the Nurturing Pixie and being able to bounce the Hopeless Nightmare or the Tithing Blade. This one not running the Virus Beetles and not running as much Hand Hate, except for there is one Invasion of Eldraine, which makes it a little bit weaker against the Azorius control matchup. But then we're bringing in green for Mosswood Dread Knight, Glissa Sunslayer, and Invasion of Chandalar. And it's an interesting way to go about it. I'm not convinced that the green is actually worth bringing it in, because Glissa, although it is a powerful card, doesn't feel like it has a whole lot of synergies. Like, we're not trying to remove specific counters from anything unless I'm missing something in this build. And then Mosswood Dread Knight is good, but it's also kind of more for like a Golgari mid-range space rather than just a strictly control space. And then Invasion of Chandalar, I think there are other cards that we can play that kind of bring back more value. And it's not that I don't like the Invasion of Chandalar and what you're doing in this deck, because you're kind of like bringing in the depopulates and then winning in the late game after the Wrath if it extends that far into the game. My problem is the double pip green. So you want to have at least 12 sources of green for a turn 3 play like the Glissa Sunslayer or the Mosswood Dread Knight. And this list does have 12 if you... Depends on how you count Mirrex, but I count this one as 12 sources of green. And you want it to have 15 sources of green if you want to play Invasion of Chandalar on turn 5. So with 12, you're not looking at most of the... There's going to be a percentage of the time where you're not actually going to be able to play the Invasion of Chandalar on turn 5, and more likely it'll be like turn 8, right? So that kind of pushes it down a little bit and makes it difficult to splash basically a double pip green card, even though we have really great fixing for it. And some of this is not... This list is not entirely rotation proof, so we're losing the Rite of Oblivion and the Depopulate and the Shattered Sanctum. So because we're losing the Vow and the Midnight Slow lands, it makes the 3-color space even harder to do, which then makes me want this to be even like Orsov even more, right? But that's just my personal thought on it. Again, one of the things that I want to kind of showcase or emphasize is that there's no wrong answers in Magic the Gathering, right? I mean, one of the things that I like the least about is like when people don't have a back and forth discussion and they're just like, this is wrong, do it this way, right? And that's what I'm trying to not do in these, is I just want to give you my ideas. Personally, I don't think the Invasion of Chandalar is worth the tax that it puts on your mana. The other thing is Depopulate wants to have 16 white sources, and right now you have 14 if you want to do a turn 4 Depopulate. And so just as is, I would at least take out one swamp and bring in one plains, because the other thing that you have for black is Shieldred wants 16 and you have 17 sources of black. So like you're already kind of pushing the mana to its extremes. But I think with this, I would be tempted to run one more white source. And if you aren't ditching the green, one way to do this would be to bring in a pain land, like the green-white pain land, like Brushland. I think could work pretty well. Or like I mentioned, just switch the swamp out for plains. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about too is just if you do decide to go into more of a black and white space, I wanted to give you some ideas that have been being explored in the archetype that could have some interesting synergies that you might like as just ideas, maybe an alternative to Invasion of Chandalar if you do want to keep the green. Because as is, you're fine with the Mosswood Dread Knight and the Glissa Sunslayer with how the mana is. This is the big problem. So Novice Inspector, it's not the best target, but it does give you additional stuff that you can sacrifice for the Riot of Oblivion, and then also just being able to give you that clue token to draw a card. Guardian of Girapur, if you look at the meta review that I did last Monday, I talked about Cabasa de Bola's Orsov control list that was running Guardian of Girapur, and I really like this because you can exile your Nurturing Pixie to get the ETB, which then can bounce one of your things again. It's just another way to get kind of like more of that Nurturing Pixie control loop going if you want to. You also could just like bounce one of the things that you want the additional, bounce the Tithing Blade, for example, right? So just an idea. The other one too that kind of works, especially if you're going to bring in the Novice Inspector and have kind of more of this fodder, is Braids works pretty well in this space. Being able to sacrifice your Hopeless Nightmare, etc. So Braids could be an alternative to explore. And then this is one that I've seen in a couple of lists, and I like so being able to play things back after you have done a depopulate without having to be in the double green space is to play Sarah Paragon. And this would be easier to play with your current mana base, and then more likely to not be a brick in your hand, and would accomplish largely what this is doing, not entirely, but still giving you that kind of like additional how do we extend the late game and rebuild if we do find ourselves extending into that space. So I hope that helps. Next up, we have Golgari Aggro by Timback Trucking. And this one, first impressions, just the first thing that I noticed was that we have way too many lands, especially for aggro. In best of one with a hand smoother, you're going to want to be running it like 22 or 23 lands, maybe even less. So it's the first thing that stood out to me was that 25 is quite a lot. 24 is kind of your standard, and then 25, 26, 27 is starting to get into more of a control space where you really don't care about flooding out. You would rather never experience getting screwed on not having enough mana. So that's one thing to think about. Obviously, we could improve the land base by bringing in more of the Blooming Marsh or the Llanowar Wastes. I don't think Llanowar Wastes is rotating, if I remember correctly. We're losing the slow lands, but not the pain lands, if I remember correctly. And so the mana base could be improved. Step one. Next up, Greedy Freebooter. So since we're talking about land bases, Greedy Freebooter wants 14 sources of black, which this one does have, to be able to play it on turn one, I think 90% of the time. And the one problem that I have with Greedy Freebooter is that it's kind of going in the opposite direction of aggro. A 1/1 is not applying a lot of pressure. So I'm not 100% sold on the Greedy Freebooter in this space. But I do like what the deck is doing. So the other question that came to my mind is this just strictly better than mono green, right? So, I guess before we move on to that, really quickly, Shieldred wants 16 sources of black, so we're a little bit shy there. We'd want to get 2 more sources of black in. And then Bristly Bill wants 13, which you're good there, right? So this is kind of like your most... the green source that's requiring, like, I need this to come down on turn 2, or the Beast Caller, which you've got enough green for. So this one's going to be a little bit harder to actually get to play down on turn 4 with the way that it's currently set up. Now, the other part of the conversation is why are we playing black, and is the black worth it compared to just going into more of a mono green space. So the pros of going to mono green was that it would be that you'd be able to play stuff like Nissa, which gets better the more force that you have in play. Cenote Scout is much better than Greedy Freebooter because it comes down and either helps you find your additional land drops for your, so you don't stumble on lands, or it's a 2/2 for 1 green, which applies a lot more pressure, right? Evolving Adaptive is another one that you kind of get a boon of being mainly green. It's a decent 1-drop that gets bigger over time. Flourishing Bloomkin is another one that I've seen kind of explored in this space that is bigger the more force that you have. You've also got the Polukranos Reborn, which wants to be almost entirely green with the triple pip green. That would be kind of a payoff to be going fully green. And then Bristlebud Farmer is kind of like the Shieldred. It's one that's better in a mostly green space that we could be playing. And then Archdruid's Charm, which is 3 triple pip green, right? Those are cards that I've seen included in kind of this Bristly Bill counter big space. Now, the pros to bringing in the black, in my opinion, is the Death Touch, because Death Touch plus Trample is a really fun time. So what I would like to see is I'd like to see 3 more Tiny Bones the Pickpocket brought in, because if we can beef this up and then give it Trample through the Drover Grizzly or the Gaia's Gift, then we'd be able to push a whole bunch of damage, right? Trample and Death Touch go very well together. And then you've also got like the Death Touch just naturally off of Shieldred the Apocalypse. I think I'd like to see a little bit more of like, what are the benefits to actually being in black-green? So the cards that like we could bring in Glissa Sunslayer has Death Touch and First Strike, would pair nicely with getting more counters and becoming a larger threat. I'm really happy to see that you do have the Gaia's Gift, as we need some way to protect our big token or counter engines. The other one that you could play around with is Tyvar's Stand. I like the 3 Gaia's Gift because Tyvar's Stand doesn't give you the trample, but it is also an option to consider. And I try to keep all of my options limited to stuff that's not going to be rotating, by the way. The other one that's kind of missing from this deck that you see in a lot of the kind of token space is the Goldvein Hydra. And this one I think fits pretty well because it already has the +1/+1 counters, which are kind of a theme going on in the mono green stompy space. And then when it dies, it gives you a whole bunch of treasure tokens, which then could work with the Tyvar's Stand a little bit better than the Gaia's Gift, but is moving less away from the Death Touch trample and just leaning heavily on itself having trample. So that would be a thing to consider. Like if you got rid of the Drover Grizzlies for the Glissa Sunslayer, then you'd have less of a way of triggering the trample. You'd want the Gaia's Gift more. If you keep the Drover Grizzlies, then you would need the trample a little bit less, and then maybe the Tyvar's Stand could find a place. Just something to consider. And the other thing too is with no real graveyard synergies or cards that we want to discard from our hand, I'm not a really big fan of the Bitter Triumph. I think it's fine if you're like discarding Forsaken Miner or something that like you are planning to bring back from the graveyard. But because this deck is really not looking to do that, I would be running the Go for the Throat over Bitter Triumph or Shieldred's Edict. I can't remember if Shieldred's Edict is rotating, but because the Shieldred's Edict is able to hit Planeswalkers while Go for the Throat is not. The other thing too is I'm not a big fan of the Shieldred, just straight up, not the Apocalypse, but just 5-cost Shieldred, because it's kind of difficult for us to get that many cards, 8 or more cards in the graveyard without having some sort of surveil or ability to put graveyard stuff into our graveyard, or being in more of a control space. So a 4/5 Menace is a fine body, and the fact that it does like cause them to sacrifice a creature or a Planeswalker does work. It's not the worst card. What I want to see though is like what I would want to explore is doing something that's more specific to Golgari, right? Because again, this one is easier to cast in a more strictly mono black space, whereas the Gitrog gives you that like, okay, we're playing in Golgari, so then we get the benefits of playing the Gitrog, and it fits into the trample haste, which you could be doing with the Goldvein Hydra, and just having these really kind of like aggressive threats that are coming in. And the haste is really nice because then if your opponent is like going to sweep, you at least get some sort of action out of it, right? Whereas if you play Shieldred on turn 5 and then on their turn 5 they Sunfall, there wasn't really a lot of value gained from the Shieldred compared to Gitrog hitting in for 6 damage, right? So it depends on how aggro you want to go, but I definitely think this could be a good one to explore. And yeah, so that's my thoughts on the deck. Hope that helps. And third up on the list is a post-rotation or rotation-proof mono-white humans build by AS. And there's been some love that went into this deck, let me tell you, right? Because like I kept being like, oh, well, maybe this, and then I was like, well, no, I think I like the way that this is lined up. So we've got like Herbalist, which when if you tap it off of the Warden of the Inner Sky, gives you that life and scry, and you also get an additional scry off the Warden of the Inner Sky. So I like that combination. The Perimeter Enforcer being able to not necessarily have much detective synergies, but because it's a human, does still pair with the Coppercoat Vanguard, where you get a 2/1 flying lifelinker for 2 with ward 1, and I think that's enough of a synergy. And so really the mono white space was losing 3 key cards, and that was Brutal Cathar, Adeline, and Thalia. And so you've already got the replacements that I would use as well. So for well, I guess with one exception, the Brutal Cathar was really good against the Boros Convoke matchup, where you're both going wide, and then switching between day and night was able to like whittle down your opponent. And you went with the Archangel of Tithes as a way to kind of tax them into not being able to block or not being able to attack effectively. And I think that I'd be tempted to explore the Phyrexian Vindicator, because I really like that one, especially against the Knight Errant of Eos, being able to block it. Because the issue that I have with the Archangel of Tides is that if they have like a 5/5 Knight Errant of Eos boosted up from the War Leader's Call, then, you know, even if they're just paying the 1 mana, they're still pressuring you with that card over and over. Whereas the Phyrexian Vindicator, like, they just can't attack into it. And it's a better body, and you're already mono white, so it, you know, the only issue I guess maybe is the Cavern of Souls, making it a little bit more difficult to cast. I like the 22 lands here. I think that it's perfectly fine, especially because most of these are like this is discounted, and so that works really nicely. And I think this is fine even in best of 3, which this deck is definitely trying to do some form of best of 3 strategy. And the other thing too is, so Adeline was really good against mono red aggro, and we're losing Knockout Blow, which was kind of like the sideboard of choice against mono red. And I really like that you went with the Elspeth Smite and have one in the main as well. This, I think, being our best option for the aggression in maybe Dimir aggro or Orsov aggro, mono red aggro post rotation. We'll see, but I think Elspeth Smite's going to be pretty good, and the fact that it exiles is pretty good for a lot of the threats. And then the last one is Thalia, was really kind of how does this deck answer Sunfall and Temporary Lockdown? And we talked a little bit about it already in the comments already, and I agree with the Anointed Peacekeeper inclusion to help up against the Azorius Control, being able to delay their sweeper down the road. So, and really, I can see the logic of Archangel of Tides, and I'm not even sure that the Phyrexian Vindicator would actually be better here. It's just, personally, that's the one that I would be playing because I know that it's good against Boros Convoke. And the last one that got submitted just hours before I did this video was by R.D. Whitney, and this is kind of a Naya Ramp control space, and it's kind of like what will Domain look like post rotation, and I really like it. I'm not sure. I don't have too much to say about this one as well. I think that like it's the question is whether or not we're gonna miss the turn 2 Leyline being able to remove something that was at flash speed that was pretty good, and since we're losing the Domain, I'm glad to see that the herd migration was removed as well. And I do think that there is still something to this space. I was also exploring around with Bant, which was similar, but instead of going Chandra and Lightning Helix, bringing in some blue. And I think there's some cool stuff there, right? I mean, like the Ancient Cornucopia and the Lightning Helix does help stabilize. And the other thing that you wanted, though, specifically you requested in the comments that I talk about the mana base and how to get the mana base to work a little bit. And so if you Google, like, Frank Karsten does a lot of really great analytics on, like, how many sources you need for X, right? So if you just Google like how many sources of red do I need for turn 1 or whatever, you should be able to find the article by Frank Karsten. And so that's where I get these numbers, right? So like when I say that like 4 double pip red, like Chandra, needs 13 sources in a 60 card deck, that's from Frank's stuff. It's from the math that he ran, the simulations that he ran. And it gets really complex because of like how much, like, is there additional card draw because up the beanstalk changes things, and like you can go really far into it. But loosely speaking, if you just use like, okay, I need 13 sources of red for 6, you're going to get pretty close to where you want to be. Now, that being said, this list is running 5, and that's okay though, because we have the Ancient Cornucopia and the Invasion of Zendikar that kind of help us fix to go find the red, right? So if you count these as red sources, then we're running the 13, which is the number that was suggested to run the 4 double pip red. So the other thing too is that like let's say that we wanted to play Up the Beanstalk on turn 2, because there's not a lot that this deck is doing outside of Up the Beanstalk on turn 2. We would need 13 sources of green for that, and we're running 17, right? The other alternative for turn 2 is that we're going to do Get Lost, and that one's on 16. So both of those are covered on like the minimum that we need to get it to work. The other thing too is there's only one Chandra, right? So like running it at the bare minimum is not ideal. You'd like to run more than the bare minimum, but because it's only one card, it's not really going to affect the deck that much. As far as my overall thoughts on the deck too, because we're losing the domain, we need some sort of alternative win condition the Herd Migration was giving us life stabilization and helping and fixing with its cycling ability, and then also giving us a win condition for the deck outside of Atraxa, right? And so I like the inclusion of the Vault-Born Tyrant because it gives us a win condition, maybe not exactly the same as Herd Migration and kind of not to that same power level, but enough that like we could probably get something to work. Rin and Realmbreaker does give us the ability for all of our lands to tap of any color, but it doesn't fix the land type into mountain plains. So all of these cards, all of these lands that are in here that are just lands, doesn't really fix for the domain space, right? So that's where Rin doesn't work for the previous, like, how do we get how do we get domain to still work? And which is why this isn't really a domain list. The other thing too is like, Get Lost works okay for like a replacement for the Leyline Binding, but it's not perfect. And Terra Sunder works okay as well, but it's like a little bit later down the curve if you're going to kick it to actually get the exile effect. So I can see where it's going. I think that it'll be interesting to see if this is actually like good enough to be in the tier 1 space in best of 3. Because the domain was kind of like flirting with the tier 1 space in best of 1, and it largely was more of a like a tier 2 deck. In my opinion, just because of its unfavored matchups against some of them weren't particularly in Domain's favor. So we'll see how things happen post-rotation, but I really like this deck, and I hope that helps you understand the mana base. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm always ready and willing to talk about anything Magic. I do enjoy it quite a bit, and last but not least, I'd like to share just a couple of pictures that I took on one of the hikes last week, because I wanted to get some backpacking done, and I wasn't able to backpack, but I was at least able to get up into the mountains, and I just thought I would share with you guys, because today is kind of a community day. All right, I'm not the best photographer in the world, but I thought I'd share it. It was very beautiful. It was a wonderful day. And so this is just some of the high mountain lakes that surround the place that I live in. And it's really not that far to go up there. And it's something that I'm always hitting myself for not getting up there as much during the summer. But the lake is looking really good this year. It's looking really full and just absolutely beautiful. And let's see if I can get it to scroll here. Yeah, so it's just, upper Wasatch Range, just beautiful high mountain lake, and, go touch some grass every once in a while. It's always good to do. And the meadows are really green this year. We've had a lot of, like, not the most amount of rainfall compared to what we saw in the past, but, like, still, everything's looking really nice up there. And the high mountain meadows are just so so healing to the soul, right? So if hopefully this finds you well, and you know, if you're frustrated by getting so many games on the draw, just let it go. You know, just remember the beauty, the beauty of nature. And there's still a little tiny bit of snow up there, but not too bad. Mostly all gone. And this is where I had lunch, which is up close to the tree line, not quite out of it. The Wasatch isn't as tall as like the Uintas in Utah, but it was a nice little place to kick back and hang out and, you know, enjoy life. So I hope you're all doing well. Thanks for being a part of my community again, and I will catch you probably the next video for certain. I'll be releasing some like draft videos if you'd like that sort of thing. Some Modern Horizons 3 drafts that got trophies and were kind of fun. On Saturday, I'll be running the winner of the poll on YouTube, so we'll see kind of who wins the vote by the time that I sit down and record it. And then Sunday, there will not be a meta breaker this week, and Monday, there will be no meta review. It'll just be my thoughts on Bloomburrow and some brew ideas. So take care, everybody. Catch you later.